as I introduce our CEO of Learner Centered Collaborative, Devin Vodicka, and the author of Learner Centered Leadership. Devin, thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to pass the mic over to you to share a little bit about who you are, why you wrote Learner Centered Leadership. Then we're going to introduce a special guest that you brought along to dive into the first part of your book. And exciting for you all, we're then going to jump into small groups to give you all a chance to discuss and chat about the book. All right, Devin, welcome.
Thank you, Kelsey. And it's so good to see so many smiling faces, see some old friends in the group, some new colleagues. So really appreciate everybody being here. So I'm Devin Vodicka, CEO of Learner Centered Collaborative. Just a little bit more about who I am, and then I'll talk about the book, and we'll get into the content in a moment. But live in Oceanside, California, northern San Diego area. I'm a dad. I've got 2 kids. My daughter is 20 and she's in a program to be a teacher, which makes me very proud. My son is 14 and he is a dancer. And this picture that you see here is like a couple years old. He's now almost as tall as me. So he's grown a lot in the last couple of years. But, by way of background, I'll talk a little bit more about my family journey. But, my dad's Czech, my mom is Dutch. Growing up as a immigrant family had a big influence on my view of education and how we need to have an inclusive experience for all learners. Along the course of my career, I've been a lab aide, I've been a teacher, I've been a bilingual director, I've been an elementary principal, a middle school principal, a curriculum director, an assistant soup of business, a superintendent, had lots of different jobs in the education system. And through those experiences, I think one thing that has really been made clear to me is the importance of relational trust and social capital and the quality of our connections to create opportunities for that sense of belonging, and also to create vulnerability, to take risks, to try new things, and to really be at our best as learners. So strong influence of relational trust and social capital is kind of a through line for me. I also love, taking sort of an asset framing perspective. Believe that that's really important for us to focus on the strengths that we have. And so you see my strengths finder top 5 there: futuristic, achiever, strategic, connectedness, learner. You can see why I enjoyed being a superintendent with those strengths, and why I love the work that I'm doing now with Learner Centered Collaborative, where we're working with hundreds of school systems across the country. So with all that, go ahead to the next one, Kelsey. Real quick, I forgot to mention my wife, by the way. She and I started dating in high school. She's in the picture too. So we've been together for 30 years now, and she's just a big influence in any success that I've had. So don't want to leave her out of all that. All right, so moving on to the book, I mentioned immigrant family. You get a picture of me with my brother and sister and my dad in the top left. He was the first in his family to ever go to college. He got a master's degree in nuclear physics in Czechoslovakia right when Russia occupied the country. He escaped from Czechoslovakia because he did not want to make weapons for the Russians. And he met my mom in Holland. They moved to California, which is where I was born. My mom, that picture on the bottom left is my mom's classroom. That's a picture from 1983. She was a computer operations teacher. And if anybody here has parents that are teachers, my childhood was spent in my mom's classroom. So nights, weekends, summers, I was in her room, and she was trying to use technology to innovate using laser discs and CD-ROMs and all sorts of really amazing innovations at that time. So I knew, as a kid, I was inspired by my mom. I knew I was going to go into education. My dad ended up being a computer teacher at the community college. And so I just grew up in this. My sister, by the way, is a teacher also My brother is the black sheep of the family. He does construction work, but most people in my family are educators. And then, a real inflection point for me was being superintendent in Vista. We're going to talk about that with Eric in a moment, but I started out doing these student forums, and they were just really transformational for me as a leader. Ended up doing more than 60 forums in the course of 6 months, talked to 1,000+ students, and learned so much through that experience. But at the end of each session, I would give the students a piece of paper, say, write down the one word that describes school for you. So at the end of it, we had 1,000 pieces of paper. We decided to do a word cloud. And you can just pop in the chat here, but what do you think was the word that was most frequently used from students to describe school? This is 10 years ago, but some of you have read my book. You've got it. Yeah, the national data is students describe school as being boring, tiring, and stressful, which is a really terrible combination. They're bored because they don't see like the challenge and the relevance in it. And they're tired and stressed because there's a ton of busy work that we ask them to do. So those three things are, bad combination. Those of you that have heard my story or read the book, in Vista, the word was irrelevant. And that really set us on this path to think about how we make learning relevant for every student. We created a personal learning model and really, saw some powerful changes, but it was all driven by students and their input. So with all of that, let's go to the next one, Kelsey. I am thrilled to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Chagala. He is the founding principal of VIDA, the Vista Unified Design Academy. And we're going to talk about his experiences as principal in Vista. But first of all, welcome, Eric. If we can give him a warm welcome. We're happy to have you here.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Love it. All right, so I'm going to be asking Eric some questions, and part of the benefit of doing this book club is to go beyond just what you can read in the book, and so we're going to get into a little bit of the story behind the story, and give you a little more context, a little more color behind the amazing transformation that happened from Washington Middle School to VIDA. But Eric, maybe to start with, can you just share with the group, your career journey, your background, and maybe a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Devin. So I was a history teacher at Rancho Buena Vista High School in the Vista Unified School District. That was going to be my community service to the world, because I really was going to be a lawyer, because that's the route I should have gone. And I love kids so much and never left. Became an assistant principal at Vista High School, was there for 8 years, and did my dissertation research there on Latinx students in poverty. And then we had this crazy superintendent guy. His name was Devin. He wasn't like any other superintendent we had ever had. And an opening came for one of the middle schools. And the middle school is called Washington Middle School. And what I had learned most profoundly as an assistant principal at the high school level is that when you're sitting with a family of 16-year-olds and they were in rehab, or they were pregnant, or they were going off to continuation school because they didn't have the credits, and started talking to the moms about, when did you feel like you sort of lost your child? It typically boiled down, they would all say middle school, but when you drilled down, it was about 7th grade. And so I thought, I have got to get into middle school and figure out what is going on, because these are incredibly important years. And so applied for Washington Middle School. And Devin told me in the interview that it was a school turnaround effort. And if it failed, the principal's career would be over. And if it was successful, then that would launch the principal's career. And so we've had a great success. And now my best friend in the world, Caleb Rashad, who's the interim CEO at High Tech High. We have a little nonprofit design joint together called Unlocked, where we go across the country and help inspire transformation and change through the design thinking process and human-centered design.
Yeah, So awesome to have you here with us, Eric. So you mentioned you were, a teacher in Vista. You were an assistant principal at Vista High School when I came in 2012. And I want to sort of paint the picture of what the district was like at that time 10 years ago. And I live in Vista. My kids go to school in Vista. It's an awesome community. But it had gone through some challenging times. So if you remember, 2012 was not quite the end of the Great Recession, and California's school finances were hit hard through that recession. So there had been years of budget cuts leading up to that point. And Vista was also going through student enrollment decline. And so on a per student level, funding was going down, and then there were less students. And so the economic hardship of the district was really quite intense. When I came in, the negotiations with the teachers union was past impasse. We were moving to fact finding, heading towards a possible teacher strike. The facilities were in a pretty desperate state of they needed attention. But maybe Eric, you were there even before me. So can you just add a little bit to what was the climate like in Vista in 2012 at the time that I came in as superintendent? What else would you add to just the fact that, resources were scarce and there were just a lot of areas that were in need of attention?
They were still reeling in No Child Left Behind.
Right.
And
Yes.
the draconian measures that especially affect students from poverty across our country. We had a superintendent who prided herself on eliminating administrative positions and administrators. Anyone who spoke out or had an idea or a creative thought was done away with. And so it was definitely an era of fear and low performance. And the only way any type of performance was measured was strictly on standardized tests, and nothing about aspirations of kids, how kids saw themselves in schools, no empathy, no care. It's very draconian is the word I keep coming back to. No joy.
Right. And I just, to add to this, so Vista is about 25,000 students. It's a high poverty school district. About 3/4 of the students are on free and reduced lunch. Has a high migrant farm working population. About 10% of the students are homeless. The county jail is in Vista. So it's, a lot of amazing things, a lot of challenges, but in that No Child Left Behind era, many of the schools were labeled as performance improvement, underperforming schools. And so it was not a very festive celebratory environment at that time, not just within the district, but sort of in education as a whole. So I came in, and one of the first things that we set about to do was figure out, what are we really trying to achieve? What is our framework for the future? What's our vision? What's our mission? What are our values? We went through a process and engaged the community, did those student forums I mentioned. And the vision that surfaced from the community was to be the model of educational excellence and innovation. And I've said this in other settings, but I felt really confident around educational excellence because I had grown up in education. I felt like I knew what that looked like. And I was a little bit terrified by this idea that we were also going to be the model of innovation. And I say that as someone whose mom was an innovative teacher, but our systems are not designed for innovation. They're designed for standardization. And so we went through a process to try to figure out, well, how are we going to be the model of innovation? And one of the things that was really clear was we needed schools to take on different models. And so Washington Middle School was probably the school in the district that needed the most attention. The first time that I went there as superintendent, a security guard greeted me at my car and came and told me that it was a dangerous school and that I needed to be careful. And I was like, these are 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. What do I need to be afraid of? But it had a reputation for being a very, very difficult place, a kind of a violent school. What was the identity that it had? It was the highest poverty middle school, highest percentage of Latino students. It had severe declining enrollment. We were having a very hard time getting students to attend the school. And so we knew something serious needed to change. And I worked with the school board, and we decided that we wanted it to be a magnet school, a school of choice. And in order for it to be a magnet school, it was going to need a new identity. But Eric, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what was the state of Washington when you came in, and this was maybe halfway through my first year as superintendent that you came in as principal. But how would you describe the school itself?
So my first day on campus was February 13th, 2013. I was the 6th principal in 7 years. I was the 3rd principal that school year. And so there was a lot of, the assistant principal at the time, he said, just smile at people. All they need is for someone to smile at them. The rotating door of administrators had been people who were going to make their mark by turning around the school with test scores and through PLCs and all the things that you were supposed to be doing, what the literature said to do. And so what we did, and often what I tell people is, the older the dead president that a school is named after, the more work that there is to do. And so people come in on tours nationally, they're like, oh, I'm at Truman High School. I'm like, no. Maybe we'll talk about Lincoln and down. Definitely Jefferson, you're in the ballpark. Adams, you got it. But this was Washington Middle School. So we share a fence line with the school for expelled youth for all of Northern San Diego County. And Devin mentioned the county jail. We're a mile from it. We're the closest school to it in the county. And so it just sort of like lays some perspective. It was very much an urban experience within a suburban setting, which is a nuance I think many of us are probably used to at this point. And so what we knew we had to do was change, but there was no like real process actually. And so we had some teachers, math teachers, who were working with Joe Bowler at Stanford University. And she was working with mathematical instruction. And because it was Washington, it's like, it was safe to experiment with these crazy Joe Bowler ideas and this Carol Dweck growth mindset stuff. And so actually, like, our math teachers were some of the most highly trained and really like turning things around before there was even a school transformation. And what Joe told them as she was, debriefing over beers with them one night after a training was, hey, have you ever heard of the D school at Stanford, the Stanford Institute of Design? They have this process they've adapted from industry to K-12 education called design thinking. It's a human-centered philosophy and approach. Maybe that would be an interesting way for you guys to go about your change process. So like empathy was at the center of it. And I drink Coors Light, I eat bologna sandwiches, I like football. I'm like, what does empathy have to do with radical transformation? And so we experimented with it. We started using it with ourselves as the adults. And what we realized, like, wow, like our creative rails are just like going off. And what I noticed as a leader is the culture and the development of us together as a team was threading very tightly through this process. And so we use that process, human-centered design, specifically then design thinking. Now we would refer to it as liberatory design with more eye towards equity. But we use that process to listen. And this is something that hadn't been done. It's like radical, right? Like to listen to what the needs of the kids were. We talked to alumni, we talked to parents. There's a 7-Eleven that was robbed every afternoon by our kids. And I went down and talked to them about the school and like what they thought was going on there. And so we had this really deep ethnographic work to figure out. And I know this is shocking, like what we found. Remember, this is like 10 years ago now. Shocking, groundbreaking. That poor Latinx youth didn't see a connection to what was happening to them in school. What was happening to them in school. And so using that, and in the first throes of VITA was we told people that our first intervention was engagement. And there were some people in the curriculum and instruction department, sort of middle management. So Devin's like, yeah, that sounds rad. Middle management struggled with it. Like, engagement isn't a strategy. Where are the notes? Where's the PD? Where's the the whole list of things? And so anyway, Devin, I forget what the question was, but
it's all good. It's all good. So Eric was talking a little bit about that change process, but essentially I went to him and said, Eric, we need a new name for the school. We need a new learning model. We can't keep doing what we have been doing at the school. And I tell the story in the book about how he came to me and he said, I've got it. Like, the school's going to be a design thinking school. And again, this is like 2013. I had never heard of a design thinking school at that time. And I was expecting him to come to me and say, we're going to be an IB school, or we're going to be a STEM school, or and I actually, like, I was terrified of this idea that it was that, if I didn't know what it was and I was the superintendent, how was that going to build excitement in the community, and how were families going to know that this was a good thing for their students? So my initial instinct was to say no, like, do something more established. But we had a high level of relational trust between the two of us. I knew that what he was doing was listening to his community, listening to his staff. And I also knew that everything that we had tried, not just, the two of us, but hardworking people before us to turn that school around, had not been successful. And so I sort of reluctantly said yes to this concept of a design thinking school. And I'm so grateful that I did, because it changed everything. So Eric, you talked a little bit about the school, at the beginning. I'll share one story about, we're going to run out of time. I have many, many stories, but maybe Eric, describe the school today. It's 10 years later. It used to be this school that was described as dangerous. We had a hard time attracting students to go to the school. The teachers were sort of worn down. What is it like today?
it is absolutely incredible. Hundreds of kids on a wait list to get in. So we could fill the school several times over just based on demand from people who, and Devin, not to get too personal, but your son didn't get in, right? He was in the random lottery. Your kid didn't get in. And he did great where he went. Like, he still had a good education.
Yes.
And toured nationally, internationally, Ethiopia, New Zealand, South Korea, lots of people coming to learn. And one of the big things, I think, like the biggest takeaway that I might add, is when I talked about engagement being the first intervention, like, yeah, that's for kids, but culture, and as an adult and as a leader, what I learned is the engagement of the adults matters as, if not more. And so there's lots of, there's a dear friend, Allison Zameda, has a book, Students at the Center. We're focused, I think in chapter 8 is a focus on our school. And so there's all this focus on students at the center, and BS statements by high up people saying, oh, if you just make these decisions based on students, then we'll be doing okay. And those decisions typically are not actually based on the students. What I learned is the engagement of the adults and teachers, really, like the incredible importance of teachers, that they're not just doers, that they don't just implement, that they just don't just teach, but if they aren't excited, they don't want to jump out of bed, if they don't want to run to school every single morning, if they don't feel that it's more about their lives and who they are than just a job, then the experience for the students, it sucks. And so how do we encourage and fire up and really engage the adults to then therefore allow all that excitement to transfer into the students and to provide opportunities for the kids that don't exist in their typical wildest imaginations about school?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is an incredible transformation story, and I want to point out that it's the same building that's still in need of repair. It's the same teachers, it's the same kids, it's a different approach. And that different approach is possible anywhere, as long as you have strong relationships and as long as you tap into people's strengths and their interests. And one of the things that Eric did that was just brilliant is he asked his teachers, what have you always wanted to teach, but you couldn't? And then they created design modules around that. And so I would show up at the school and they would be doing rocketry and cryptozoology and forensics, that there's all sorts of things that you don't see in a typical school, but it tapped into the passion and the interests and the creative capacity of the educators. And it just lit up the students as well. And so, yeah, by every metric, it's an unbelievable success story, the demand to get into the school, but you can look at anything and it's all better than it was, at the beginning of this journey. And I, really appreciate Eric's leadership and the hard work of the staff. And it's a really, really incredible story. And we know, Eric, that so many of these turnaround efforts don't work. And so we talked about the importance of culture and relationships and tapping into strengths and interests and values. Maybe give like a couple of other words of wisdom about why it worked here where it didn't work in so many other places.
So this happens way too often, and it happens enough for it to like actually be a story to anchor in. School groups will come in for a tour to listen to hear, and you can always tell who the administrator is because they're dressed differently than the teachers. And we'll be talking about the journey, we'll be talking about the experiences, talking about what the kids do, we're talking about our measures of success and what we consider success. And then we'll start talking, because the base ground here is culture, is human-centered culture. And they're more often than not, I'd say at least 80% of the time, that administrator in the room at the, I'm at the like head of the table, like the weird uncle at Thanksgiving, and everyone's around. And the administrator will look at their watch, knowing that they're going to like high-tech high necks and thinking about traffic. They'll say, that's great. We understand, like, culture, trust, got it. Like, we excel there. And people say this, we excel there. We want to know like nuts and bolts and nitty gritty. And then to watch the reaction of the teachers when that happens, and the darting eyes back and forth, and the smug little faces that they make at each other about, oh yeah, like we got that right, like we're good there. And occasionally, like a brave teacher will say, actually, dear principal or director, whatever, I think that might be something really good for us to talk about. Because there's all these sort of confusions about what makes organizational culture, especially as it pertains to a school setting, what makes actually successful and what doesn't make it successful. And so we spend a lot of time trying to talk about culture, and it's this disconnect, because people can quote, they always throw at me that famous quote of culture eats strategy for breakfast. Every administrator knows it. They all want to say it. And because they know the phrase, they feel like they're okay. Like I host the holiday staff party every single year. And so that is called, like, we are good. I give them presents, and we do employee of the month, and we have a park. All these things that actually miss the mark on what culture actually is. And so there's two things. I think one, culture is overstated and undervalued, understood. The second is when people ask, like, hey, if you went back 9 years and you did it all again, what would you do differently? And what I would do differently, and it sounds stupid again, it's like, this seems so like duh. You can't underestimate the value and importance of time, and you can't underestimate and undervalue the importance of teachers in transformation and unlocking their genius in what actually happens.
Yeah. So Eric, we get a few questions in the chat that we're going to want to dive into, but before we do that, I also want to just, you're also a dad. Your own daughters went to Vita. Can you talk for just a second about what that was like to see your own kids go through this experience?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest testament to whether it was really successful or like, was it just fluff and hubbub, or was it actually something that mattered? And so one of the lenses that we took as we were designing it, as we were opening up, was what if, because there's a chunk of us, a group of us that were about the same age. What if we use the lens of designing a place that we would want our own kids to go to? Like, no one's going to purposely F up their kids and send them to a bad experience. We may do that to other people's kids, but not to our own kids. And so this lens and this perspective of designing something we'd want our own kids to go to was incredibly important, even for people that had aged out of the child rearing years, or that didn't have kids, or theirs had already gone through. It was still an important view of, this isn't just a job. And Devin helped with coming up in the naming of the school with committees, and it's called the Vista Innovation Design Academy. That's a long name. We don't use it. We say VIDA. That's the acronym. And VIDA in Spanish means life. So we aspire for this to be more about our lives and who we are than just a school. And so, you know, with my kids, my youngest just left. They're less than a year apart. So the older one left the year before that. I'm able to see what they do in high school, how they compare to the stories that they bring home about the other kids who went to multiple other middle schools. And we pulled our kids out of one city, brought them to Vita. Now they're back in their home city for that comparison. But they were there during all the COVID stuff. And so something my wife and I talk about all the time is, even though so much of like what we hoped for and what we aspired for and what we thought they would get by going to Vita was stolen from them, because the culture of the place and what it offers is not just school, but it's about life. Like, we wouldn't have wanted them anywhere else through the pandemic because of that. And so it's about nurturing, it's about aspirations for child and adult. It's about love. My shirt says joy-existence. My best friend Caleb came up with that thought. It's a joyful resistance to what is, and how do we fight against sort of the status quo and the legacy of the system in order to provide something more.
Love it. All right, so I think Kelsey, we actually will do the small groups now. I did put in the chat link to the Vita website. And one thing that I've always appreciated about Eric is he is very accessible. So you can, find him on social media. You can reach out for questions. I am confident he would be happy to, have an extended conversation with each of you. But we would love for you to have some time to sort of think about what you've heard. What are some takeaways? What are some things that you can translate from sort of concept into next actions in your environment? And so I'll turn it over to Kelsey, who will describe how we'll do this.